Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what kind of thinker is the Buddha?
What do you mean?
Is he a spiritual thinker, perhaps a philosopher, a prophet?
I believe that he's all of those and simultaneously none of them. He reveals to us the true nature of reality, the meaning of birth and death, the nature of Buddhahood and the path to it, and more. However, at the same time, he's a man who exists in this world, born of his mother's womb, and who walks on 2 feet and eats the same foods as all of us. There is no doubt that he's special, but simultaneously, if you didn't know who he was, you might not recognize him if you passed him on the road.
Fascinating and true. To the unenlightened, he looks as though he were any other man, but to those who have the mind set on awakening, his appearance, his power, and his wisdom are quite clear. This is his omniscience in practice. His omniscience in this way is charismatic, one might say?
Indeed, I would agree.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing whether or not Buddhism is actually a religion. Why do some say that Buddhism is not a religion? What evidence do they have for that claim? What are the historical roots of this debate? We hope you enjoy. So, why do some say that Buddhism is not a religion?
We have touched on this topic on the show in the past, but I think that it's a concept that deserves its own episode. The reason for that is I think that it strikes at the heart of one of the most important and yet unanswerable questions in the humanities. What actually is the line that divides religion and philosophy? Is there a line? How do we define either of these words? This question calls upon us to offer a definition for religion that captures all religion in the world, which is impossible, and it requires us to offer a definition for philosophy that is simultaneously capturing all philosophies in the world while also separating it from religion and also not showing bias towards one or the other. I can offer my own definition on this question, and then I can offer some historical perspectives on the issue at hand, but first I'd like to hear what you think, Docs. What is the difference between philosophy and religion, and how do you define each of those terms?
So, disclaimer, I have never been a particularly religious person, and that's still the case right now, so my perspective on the religious side of this question is an outsider perspective. So, something that was drilled into me multiple times in my STEM training was that the most important and interesting part of a graph, the part that you most need to get correct, are the lines between two states. So, my approach to this question is to focus on and delineate where the things are different. And from what I have observed, the difference is in the verbs. In a religion, one prays, one worships, preaches, etc. While in a philosophy, one proposes, explains, debates, convinces, or fails to convince. I think this framing also captures the fact that philosophy and religion overlap significantly. In both, one reads and studies, one contemplates and proclaims. Many religious texts contain philosophical arguments, and many philosophies use religion as their basic building blocks. So, I think it's totally possible to create a philosophy that does not include religion. But I'm having a hard time thinking of a way to have a religion that does not also contain a philosophy. Because a religion is generally going to have implications and make arguments about metaphysics and ethical conduct. And those are two topics that I think are just generally going to overlap with philosophy, at least the way we think of it. It's not so much a answer as a framework, I guess, for looking at a situation and thinking as much as one can, what is the difference between the two?
I actually like that approach of focusing specifically on the verbs because that's a much more individualized and much more evidence-based kind of way of breaking these two apart. And I would also agree, like you say, that there's so much overlap between the two, and also that while secular philosophy exists, it's virtually impossible to say that religion without philosophy exists. I don't think there is anything like that. And I think that while they are two different methods of investigating the nature of reality, or in some cases claiming things about the nature of reality and about personhood and the meaning of life and death, I don't think that you can have religion without that. And I don't think you can have any sort of secular religion, if that makes sense. One that relies on both evidence-based investigation of reality without prayer, preaching, worship, ritual, so on and so forth. So it's an interesting question.
Hey there, Docs, while he was editing this episode, cut again for a moment to add an aside. We said that we couldn't really think of a secular religion, but that's not actually true. The Satanic Temple in the United States is doing some interesting stuff that makes it kind of count as a secular religion, and I think it's worth a mention here. So there you go. A secular religion is not as impossible as we made it here. It's just a very niche thing.
My answer to the question is that there really is no single definition for either word. There are two possible methods for attempting to answer the question that scholars have attempted over the past 300 years. And the first method that I've seen is to try and define religion singularly, wherein you try and attempt to create a definition that captures all religions on earth and boils down to a single, unified theory of religion. Many scholars in the 18th through the 20th centuries attempted to do this, and they made good, worthwhile attempts, but the approach is inherently flawed because of the sheer amount of religious variety and diversity in the world, which cannot be encompassed by any sort of biased Western theorizations. We won't go into the theories in detail here, but they are out there. If you are interested, you can go look at E.B. Tylor, William James, Sigmund Freud, Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx, Max Weber, Mircea Eliade, E.E. Evans Pritchard, Clifford Geertz, Mary Daly, and Catherine Lofton, and many, many, many more. These are all Western scholars who have, at some time or the other, attempted to attack this question of what religion actually is and what it actually does in the world around us and in our lives. I'll include some citations in the show notes for each of these thinkers and also for books that I've read that have boiled down what they have thought into much more readable and concise terms. The other method for defining religion that I've seen is to define it in plurality, and this is the method that I usually stick with. This method essentially functions on one foundation, which is you know it when you see it. You know when people are doing religion and when they're doing philosophy, for the most part. This connects to what you were saying about the different verbs. You know when somebody is praying and worshiping and doing ritual versus when you know someone is actually debating or writing or trying to make some sort of argument about something.
It's worth noting that there are religions that have a vigorous debating aspect to them as well. I've been told that there's a lot of debate and discussion over the meanings of different scriptures in Judaism, for example.
That's absolutely right. Saying that you know what religion is when you see it is sort of a trash can answer in that it really doesn't have any guiding principle. It just is catching everything that an individual is seeing and experiencing. But I think that it really holds true. It's easy to say that philosophy is secular and relies on foundations that are not religious, and that religion is not secular and not founded on the same basis. But this just doesn't quite stick because there is religious philosophy, so it gets complicated. The reason why I hold this perspective, I know it when I see it, is because all of the scholars I mentioned a minute ago were knowingly or otherwise applying Western and Judeo-Christian biases onto the landscape of religion that we see in the world today. There are religions out there in East Asia and other non-Western areas in particular, which fundamentally challenge any definition of religion which is based solely on Judeo-Christian religions and all of the quote-unquote others in that system, which we can collectively refer to as like pagans here. To speak specifically, there are groups in East Asia and other places which do not believe in an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God, and they don't go to a church building and worship once a week, and they don't observe the 10 Commandments, and so on and so forth. But these people are still absolutely religious. Buddhism is a group that falls into this category of religious people who do not really believe in a God in the Judeo-Christian sense, and they don't often go to a church or a building to do worship, and so on and so forth. The historicity of this issue of where Buddhism fits in Asia that makes this relevant is that the words philosophy and religion did not exist in Asian languages until about the 18th century. These are introduced words. We can argue about whether or not these categories of thought existed in Asian societies historically, but we know that the words specifically for religion and philosophy in modern Chinese, Korean, and Japanese were adaptations to the vocabulary that was used by Europeans who went to these places and started using their colonizer Judeo-Christian brains and looking at what these people were doing and started calling it religion or philosophy. That means that this is an introduced word during the colonial encounter in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. People in Asia and the West were forced to start defining these words in some kind of intelligible way, and that had lots of interesting results that we can't get too far into in this episode, but ultimately defined the religious landscape of Asia for the last 200 years. For example, some of the earlier scholars I mentioned earlier who attempted to define religion were doing so actually as part of this defining our terms process that happened in the colonial encounter. And often you'll see that scholars like E.B. Tyler or William James actually made extensive use of imperial inroads to go and be able to study people that they viewed as being religious but not Christian or Jewish or Muslim to try and create a grand unified theory of religion. Coming back to the original question at hand, some of these Judeo-Christian characters in the West looked at Buddhism in India and China and actually did not agree on whether what they were looking at was religion or philosophy. To make matters worse, whoever they asked experienced difficulty answering the question meaningfully because they were alien concepts to begin with. Otherwise, they had a political agenda in claiming that Buddhism was either religion or philosophy. The people who were claiming that it was a philosophy wanted to elevate it to the level of high-concept academic investigation to align it with the increasingly secular European academy. In Europe, the Enlightenment era led to an increasing suspicion of the value of Christianity in society and sought other means of understanding the world, and found those means in science and other forms of secular analysis, one of these being secular philosophy. So, some groups in Asia borrowed some of the prestige of those fields and claimed that they had been doing the same thing for thousands of years already. We will talk about their evidence for saying so in a moment, but those who claim that Buddhism was a religion were doing so for a number of different reasons, including but not limited to wanting to place Buddhism in a position in society that gave it a kind of intellectual power over culture, tradition, politics, and society that they believed science and secular analysis did not have. This includes power over the meaning of life and death, power over the afterlife, power over ultimate meaning and truth, and more. This group was the minority group, but they existed all over East Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries. They believed that Buddhism's power lay only in its capacity as a religion and not as a secularized and academic system of thought about the way the world works. They were overpowered, however, by those that aimed to render Buddhism as a philosophy in the interest of aligning it with modernity, the Western Academy, and so on. They were overpowered, however, by those that aimed to render Buddhism as a philosophy in the interest of aligning it with modernity, the Western Academy, and aligning themselves with what they believed to be Western rationality.
What evidence do they have for the claim that Buddhism is a philosophy?
Many who made this claim from the Western side did not view Buddhism as having a godlike figure like Christianity does. They understood the Buddha to be a historical person who did not turn the attention of his followers toward faith in a higher power that could not be seen or touched or heard. This was as opposed to Jesus, for example, who was no ordinary man, but was instead one of the Holy Trinity, and the other two characters in said Trinity were not historical figures. Moreover, they digested Buddhism textually first, rather than ritualistically, and so they did not see all of the ritualistic dimensions of Buddhism initially, but rather only saw the texts which lay out the doctrine as we have seen it on this show, in a very philosophical manner at times. This includes the doctrine of impermanence, emptiness, non-self, etc. These doctrines, they believed, had serious alignments with what they were discovering through their own scientific methods. To that end, they began to see Buddhism as a whole as having the exact same goal as science, even if it had slightly different means of achieving that goal, And that goal is to investigate and realize the true nature of reality as it is. This being the case, many Europeans in the colonial encounter with Asia began to regard the Buddha as a scientist or a philosopher rather than as a religious leader. At the same time, Asian people were saying the very same things about Buddhism and fueling this fire because, as I said before, the Western Enlightenment era ideology was that religion was superstitious, anti-modern, and archaic, and in order to jump on board with that and achieve modernity themselves and avoid colonization, Asian people began to frame Buddhism in the exact same light. They looked at the discoveries of Western philosophers and said, our guy was up to the same thing 2,000 years ago, and here's why he did a better job of it than your guy. This process required emptying out the ritual, mythological, and overtly religious points in Buddhism. Anybody who knows anything about Pure Land Buddhism or esoteric Buddhism or many other types of Buddhism that we've talked about on this show ought to be yelling at me right now saying that Pure Land Buddhism is an example of an expression of Buddhism that contains what these Christians might regard as overtly Judeo-Christian, such as the heavy reliance on faith and the grace of Amida Buddha. Or in the case of esoteric Buddhism, there's an eternal cosmic Buddha who has the same omnipotence and the same omnipresence as a Christian God. How was this reconciled? It was by a process of silencing those parts of the story and turning the volume up on others, such as the perceived relationship between the components of Zen and Stoicism, for example. It's a fascinating process that I recommend reading a lot more about. I'll add some book citations in the show notes for this.
What are the historical roots of this debate?
In the West, we have everything arranged in particular boxes for the sake of understanding them and their relationships to each other. And these boxes reflect, as a whole, the structure of our modern Western worldview. These boxes include the concept of the state and the nation. The state is an association of people characterized by formal institutions of government, including laws, permanent territorial boundaries, and sovereignty. And a nation is an idea. It's a group of people with what they perceive to be shared culture, shared history, shared language, etc. In the West, we have also created boxes for religion, a box for philosophy, a box for science, and they each have some of the stuff that we mentioned before. The religion box has prayer and worship and ritual. The science box has a secular and objective and evidence-based investigation into the nature of reality, and philosophy shares some of the characteristics of both. In the Enlightenment era, the religion, philosophy, and science boxes were a lot more separated than they are now. What I mean to say is that the Enlightenment era marked the beginning of a European movement to separate investigation of the nature of reality by means of dividing it according to evidence-based or not, verifiability and falsifiability and repeatability, or faith. And so ideas and scholarship and knowledge that we had created up to that point in human history, they were being broken up according to, is this religious, is this philosophical, is this scientific? I bring up the metaphor of this box. I bring these boxes up because the boxes in Asia during the exact same time period, the Enlightenment era, the colonial encounter, they were arranged entirely differently. State and religion were all in one box together. The idea of a nation existed, but did not necessarily exist in its own box. Religion and philosophy and science were three boxes that had nearly total overlap with all of each other. When the Europeans came around, they see the Asian world in terms of their boxes, not the Asian boxes, but the European boxes. And they say, what is in all of these different boxes? What is in your science box? We have the Industrial Revolution, the scientific method, steam power, guns, refrigeration, and so on. What is in your religion box? We have Christianity, faith, revelation, an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent deity, and so on. So, because of the power imbalance, because of the threat of the colonial encounter, Asian peoples were forced to start sorting out their boxes according to these new Western terminologies. And they took this time and chance to sort them out in a way that made their material, their knowledge, appear equal or superior to that which the West had created up to that point. This sparked a debate among Asian peoples about where stuff went and how they should be sorted. Should they sort it according to evidence-based repeatability, scientific method? Should they sort it according to faith? How should they actually make sense of all this? What was the quote-unquote science box, and how do you decide what goes in there? What is the religion box, and what goes in there? They were forced to make sense of their own territory using a map that was drawn of a different place and in a foreign language, or otherwise be conquered by these colonial powers. One example of how this plays out is that they say that their religion and science boxes are better than the Europeans' ones because they actually contained both investigation of the nature of reality and meaningful claims about the meaning of mind and existence and birth and death and more. Equating their knowledge to the level of intellect and prestige that they saw the West as having afforded them soft power to avoid colonization. This didn't always actually work. As you know, the colonial encounter in Asia is not a success story for East Asia, or for Asia at large, even. It did not go as well as they might have hoped that it would, but the attempt to avoid colonization by means of this soft power was absolutely something that these East Asian cultures and countries and nations and states were pointed at in this 18th, 19th century. In the end, the knowledge of these East Asian cultures, it just didn't fit nicely into one of the Western boxes or the other. And so now, even to this day, the debate continues. Some say you can be Buddhist and be Christian at the same time, because it is only a philosophy, whereas others regard it as a standalone religion. I think that the present scholarship widely agrees that Buddhism is a religion unto itself, and it is only in the popular discourse that it's regarded as Eastern philosophy. The idea of Eastern philosophy is rather archaic and highly critiqued nowadays, but you'll still hear plenty of people walking around on the street calling it that, and so there's still a lot of catching up to do with regards to where the scholarship has landed and what the popular discourse about these things still is.
We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Join us next week where we will discuss the Buddhist figure known as Subhuti. Who is Subhuti? What role does he play in the text? What is his role in Mahayana Buddhism? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.